And welcome back to Whiskey Politics. I'm Dave Sussman, your host and purveyor at whiskeypolitics.net. You can find us at ricochet.com. You can find our YouTube channel, and you could listen to us all over iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, your favorite podcast applications, and America's Voice Television Network. The news this week has made me actually kind of ill. I'm just so sick and tired of all of this. But we got to pull it apart and put it back together. And who better than Noah Rothman? Noah is the associate editor at Commentary Magazine. You've probably heard his podcast with John Podhoretz, and great podcast, by the way. I listen to it as much as I can. You've also seen him at NBC News, Fox, CNN News, and he is the author of the upcoming book, Unjust Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. Welcome, Noah. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate
Thanks for joining us. So, okay, let's kind of back, from the 5,000-foot overview with Kavanaugh. What are you making of all of this right now?
I don't know. I was actually recording a podcast with some other people who I like very much, and they were describing to me, as I was discussing the vote totals by which Judge Kavanaugh would be confirmed, declining to speculate, but speculating nevertheless that he was going to be confirmed, when the information regarding Dr. Ford came out and her accusation and her identity being revealed. And that really threw everything for a loop. I'm not exactly sure how this is going to go. And now that we've decided, and it's unclear whether or not this is going to happen. It seems like, according to Dr. Ford's attorney, they're being a little cagey as of this recording as to whether they're going to show up. But there is supposed to be this public hearing between Kavanaugh and Dr. Ford, and they're going to describe what they think happened, and it's going to be this very performative exercise that I don't know if Judge Kavanaugh can survive. He's not a politician. He doesn't have a real performative element to him. Can he create the high-tech lynching moment that really saved Clarence Thomas's nomination in the early 1990s? I am not so sure. And if his performance, and it's purely performative at this point, was going to be judged like that, not like a confirmation process should be, when an individual's legal merits are taken into account, it's going to be determined by the public. And can Judge Kavanaugh influence the public in the same way that Dr. Ford presumably can in the Me Too moment? I'm not sure. I think his nomination is very seriously jeopardized.
So we're talking here about a handful of votes that may be questionable. A flake, obviously. We got Susan Collins, Murkowski. The question is, and what you just referred to, is in this Me Too movement that we're in. I'm old enough to remember and watching very closely the Clarence Thomas hearings with Anita Hill, and you had Arlen Specter, who came out really hard against Anita Hill. They say that you can't do that today, right?
Yeah, you probably couldn't, although Mr. Specter performed a very good, service, a public service there under this. It was probing examination of Professor Hill, and I'm not sure you could do that today. But in the course of his questioning, he essentially got Anita Hill to say on the record that quote, she was generally likely informed by a Democratic staffer that her allegations alone would be sufficient to force Clarence Thomas to withdraw his nomination, that she would never have to remove any confidentiality agreement that she had initially with these allegations. And you can draw a straight line to today, when this morning Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, said that it was his understanding that confidentiality was in place, the confidentiality agreement was in place, when Dr. Ford's name was leaked to the press, forcing her to withdraw her confidentiality and come out. She had no choice at that point. And he said, asked where that leak came from, he said, I don't know, but some staffers on the Judiciary Committee had access to this letter. Draw your own conclusions. It sounds to me like a mirror image of the Anita Hill case in an attempt to get history right, as it were, this time around. And the victim here is Dr. Ford. Dr. Ford is going to be put through a really traumatic process that she did not want to endure, and she is being made to do so for the benefit of a Democratic political objective, which is to scuttle this nomination. That, to me, is unconscionable, but I think you and I are the only people saying it.
Okay, so the thought process is, and we know what their true motivation is here, obviously, but the thought process is you can have an accusation from 37 years ago. It could be unsubstantiated, may not even know where and when this actually took place, so nobody can ever come back and prove that he wasn't there at this time and place, but we can't question her. Is that about?
Well, I think there's sort of a contradictory message on the part of Democrats. Yes, they have said for quite some time that they wanted a hearing, that staff-level interviews of Dr. Ford was not appropriate at this point and needed to be a much more public venue. And then when this public venue was agreed to by Republicans on the Judiciary Committee, I think Senator Feinstein's office said that it was far too soon, that they were sandbagged by this announcement, that they didn't have any input in it. Pretty transparently suggesting that they wanted to delay this process as long as possible and to get it as close as possible to the midterm elections. At least that's my inference. I don't think they're saying, don't question this person. I think it'd be unfair to suggest that they're saying we don't want to hear her side of the story. Everybody I've heard on the Democratic side says we want to hear this person's story. And why wouldn't they? I think they think, and with good reason, that she's going to be a very sympathetic figure, an articulate figure, and a compassionate figure, and somebody for whom a lot of sympathies are going to be marshaled, and that could have a very serious deleterious effect, downward pressure on Judge Kavanaugh's polls. And because this is a political process, Judge Kavanaugh's polls really matter, as did Clarence Thomas's, to be fair. Right. And that could scuttle his nomination. So I wouldn't go so far as to say Democrats want to keep her hidden. They're doing their best to get her out there.
But you already hear from the left right now that they're saying that this cannot possibly be a fair hearing anyway, even if she does come forward. I think, and you put this out there, Emily Singer, she's a leftist journalist. She suggested that there cannot be a fair hearing for Ford because these are white male senators. I mean, this is now how the leftist thinks. If you're white and you're a male, there is no way that you could be an arbiter of this.
Yeah, she said, and some others who I think are Democratic-leaning have said that the optics associated with an all-white male panel of Republican members of the Judiciary Committee would be unfavorable to Republicans. My interpretation of that, my very uncharitable interpretation of those remarks, is that they're saying that this individual cannot get a fair hearing from these white male senators based on their identity, because otherwise I don't know why you would bring that up. I don't understand what the point of raising that at all is unless you want to imply and infer and suggest to people who share the commonality of the English language that these individuals are incapable of creating a sympathetic hearing for this individual, because otherwise you're playing a little bit too coy. And it's a game I decline to play. I'm going to call it what I hear, which is that you're saying that these individuals have a racial consciousness that they cannot transcend. And as such, they're going to create an atmosphere that is hostile towards Dr. Ford. I think that's prejudicial. I think that's wrong. And I think if you called them on it, they would say, no, that's not what I'm suggesting. But I don't appreciate it when they try to play the double game there, and I think it's appropriate to call them out on the inference of what they're suggesting.
In this age of Me Tooism, how does Judge Kavanaugh refute this or disprove this?
I don't know. I don't know if he can. And that's part of the problem, is that the protections afforded, in a courtroom, evidentiary standards, due process, presumption of innocence don't apply here, because this is obviously not a courtroom. This is the court of public opinion. So the answer is that I don't think there is a standard by which Judge Kavanaugh can effectively clear his name, just as I don't think that Dr. Ford has any ability to convince people who are skeptics of the correctness of her story. Too much time has elapsed. Her memory has understandably faded. She cannot say when this happened or where it happened, or really even marshal a lot of evidence to have somebody investigate it, even if they were so inclined. And the FBI has said, we're not going to investigate this because it's a local issue. And even if local authorities were interested, the statute of limitations has elapsed. So again, this is not a legal issue. It is really just about appearances. And the appearances are not great for Judge Kavanaugh, particularly based on the Me Too moment, the nature of the number of powerful men protected by their institutions who were toppled in this moment, and duly and rightly so, should be added. But the standard of evidence that was brought to bear against those individuals while not reaching the standard that would be acceptable in a courtroom, was nevertheless at least a preponderance of evidence. We have just not enough to go on here to even match that standard. It is such a low evidentiary bar that I can't see any conscionable way in which anybody would stand to allow a man with by all accounts, exemplary legal career to be felled by these accusations. They're just not substantive enough. And because we don't have any hard evidence, now you've started to see people, again, understandably, I think understandably, sort of impose their own personal experiences on this woman's story and on their experiences and on their belief of how Judge Kavanaugh comported himself. We had this piece in The Atlantic that was just praised to the heavens by members of the journalism class, and it was a very powerful and compelling piece in which she admitted and she was assaulted by a man in high school in a very similar set of circumstances, and it was resulted in suicidal depression. And those circumstances are not dissimilar from what Dr. Ford is alleging, and therefore she believes her. Now, she's imposing her own experiences on this, and that's really deeply unfair. But because there's no hard evidence for us to discuss here, it's understandable that we would create a set of circumstances for us to continue having a conversation about something, because otherwise there's nothing to discuss. There's nothing there.
This is a really scary moment for us. I'm a father of 2 sons. I know you've got a young family. And the idea that my sons could be in any time in their entire life accused of something, whether it happened or not, and it's 30, 40, 50 years from now, and it can ruin them. I mean, I think we've crossed a threshold here, and this didn't just happen recently. This has been going on for a while, but it seems to be happening on one side of the aisle, whether it's Anita Hill. I mean, for example, whether you'd believe Juanita Broderick or not, her story is very compelling. We've had her on the show. We went in depth with her. They didn't want to give her in any way. I mean, there's been articles lately that have come out and said, I believe her, but when she first came out, they marginalized her significantly. Now you've got Keith Ellison, right? There's police reports. You've got medical reports. You've got therapist notes that confirm Keith Ellison's ex-girlfriend was attacked and threatened. We heard nothing about this from the left. They said they're going to review it. So this is a complete double standard, right?
I don't know about the Keith Ellison thing, because I saw the New York Times report, and it had said that his accuser had this video of this incident, and then she kind of lost it, and then she told the Times she just wouldn't produce it, and she got very indignant about the nature of asking a woman who is describing an assault to provide evidence of that assault, suggesting or questioning her experience. It was shady enough for me that I was concerned about even touching the Keith Ellison thing, because consistency should be a virtue here, even if Democrats are not going to engage in it. I decline. I'm going to be as consistent as possible, and I don't necessarily believe that the evidence suggests that Keith Ellison did anything wrong. Bill Clinton, on the other hand, is pretty well confirmed to have done just about everything that he is accused of doing, and the reckoning for him is coming a little too late, but it is coming. It's not the major high-profile figures that worry me, the people who generate headlines. It's the individuals like, you described your young family, my young family. It's the people who will never make a headline, who are injured by these policies. Specifically, and we mentioned preponderance of evidence standards in the last bit. Preponderance of evidence was the standard that was established in the 2011 My Dear Colleague letter sent out by the Barack Obama Education Department to universities and schools that established a system in which these universities created these star chambers, these extrajudicial courts that were designed to adjudicate sexual assault claims on campuses, and that perpetrated some of the most grave injustices that deprived students of their Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights, that resulted in students going to actual court and having these quote-unquote verdicts against them overturned, and costing the school systems that were subject to these lawsuits millions of dollars. Emily Yoffe over at Slate in 2014 has a fantastic piece detailing some of these the allegations that were mobilized against these predominantly male students, almost exclusively male students, which amounted to persecution, and they had very little to do with evidence and a lot to do with ideology. And it was keeping these things out of the court system that was the most valuable aspect of them for the social justice left, in particular, because it was the standards of evidence in a courtroom that were too high. The constitutional obligation to confront your accuser was too traumatic, These are the kind of things that are anti-legal, they're anti-constitutional, and they're getting a foothold, particularly on the left, which has a, a very substantial problem with the objective kind of justice that we associate with the Anglo-American system of jurisprudence. And that's sort of a key theme in my book. And it's becoming a much more widespread problem.
I feel like we have crossed a Rubicon at this stage right now, and of course it's political. Obviously the timing, and I've read a lot of Democrats that I respect who've also questioned this as well, because it is so blatantly political. Dianne Feinstein held this. She had it in July. It's mid-September. Right? So this is right out of the game book that we saw happen with Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. But what scares me today more than anything is that everybody is so politically divided. And I am so willing to believe one side or another based upon my political disposition. And it goes back to what you're saying. This is not a legal hearing. This is now a public relations hearing. And that's the scariest thing of all here.
Yeah, I mean, the Senate is supposed to, by virtue of its sort of, it is so allergic to proportional representation that it is supposed to have very little to do constitutionally with public sentiment. Obviously with the 17th Amendment, it become a direct election situation, and so the public has quite a bit of input on how senators perform. But the confirmation of a judge, well, a political process. Anything that happens in Congress is inherently political, so we shouldn't call it apolitical. But the public is really not supposed to have a veto over the confirmation of judges to the federal courts. Judge Kavanaugh, in particular, has been through this process, pretty thoroughly. According to Orrin Hatch, he had 6 FBI vettings. He's
for the D.C. Circuit.
Right, he's been confirmed to the D.C. Circuit previously, and so it's as though that when you, I mean, quite obviously, I'm not saying anything that's new here, but when you're confirmed when you're nominated to the Supreme Court, all the rules are thrown out, and you're treated like a very different creature because the stakes are so high. And I'm also not the first to say that the stakes are so high because Congress has abrogated its authority and shifted its constitutional authority onto the courts, onto the executive branch in a way that the founders would probably find bizarre, to see a power center simply just abandon its authority and its constitutional obligations. So this isn't necessarily going to be something that can be fixed overnight. But the fact that public opinion polls are really the foundation upon which Judge Kavanaugh's nomination will either survive or collapse is scary. It's not supposed to be a democracy. This is not the demos who should be selecting our judgeships, and the fact that they are leaves us vulnerable to the will of the mob. That was not what the founders intended.
I try not to get engaged on Twitter. I use Twitter. I follow you. I follow several other journalists that I respect, but I don't get into the swamp with it. But I haven't seen this much anger on Twitter. I don't know if ever. People are furious about this. Do you think this is going to energize the right and independents to come out in 2018's election in a couple months? Yeah,
I'm not sure. It seems like Republicans have been allergic to being energized to go to the polls. Since Donald Trump's election, you've seen just about every lopsided Democratic victory or substantial Democratic advantage in these special elections and the off-year elections in 2017 has been, in part, I think in large part, due to the absence of Republicans from the polls. I'm really jazzed about this. I think this is a grave injustice. I'm willing to make this the hill to die on, but I can't speak for the electorate. The electorate has been substantially harder to mobilize in the Trump era, the Republican electorate, than they had been at any point in the last decade. And I suspect that has very little to do with conditions on the ground like economic performance or Donald Trump's judicial appointments, both of which have been pretty stellar. I think it has a lot more to do with comportment and character in the Oval Office that is turning off 15 to 20% of Republican voters who would otherwise support the nominees, the straight ticket line, and they'd be energized to come out and vote. That 15 to 20% doesn't really show up in job approval numbers for the president. There's not a lot of Republicans, but it is enough to keep the party from performing very well in November. So I don't know whether or not Judge Kavanaugh has that kind of juice. He doesn't seem to. The polling has not been very good for him. So I don't know whether or not this kind of an abstract offense against American ideals will energize voters as much as it should. It absolutely should, but I don't know if it will.
You've been a pretty honest broker of how you viewed this administration. You have commended him on the things that I think we would all agree are stellar, just as judicial appointments, as you just talked about, the economy. And you have certainly been vocal in your reservations about certain behavioral attributes as well. You think it's only 15 to 20% of the Republicans that have a problem with this president, enough for them not to come out?
To clarify, I think it's 15 to 20% of self-identified Republicans. There are quite a lot of Republicans that I don't know if we can quantify, but there are a lot of Republicans who no longer identify as such in the Trump era.
Okay.
They used to be Republicans. They left the party, or rather they no longer identify as registered Republicans to pollsters. It's harder to know exactly how many that is, but you can check Gallup trends, for example, about self-identification, and it shows a pretty consistent drop-off. We can't tell exactly what that number is, but it is substantial enough to, I think, have a significant effect on and exert downward pressure on Republican performance at the ballot box.
This is interesting because, and I want to get to another point here. I know you're stretched for time, but the numbers of people that have now considered themselves an independent, me being one of them, okay? How do you quantify that now as far as their political leanings, right? And that's the hard question, because I know a lot of Democrats are, quote unquote, walking away from the Democrat Party as well. But if you've got a huge number of people that are non-registered or registered as independents or nonpartisan, depending upon the state, how reliable are the polls?
Yeah, well, we don't really know. The polls have not really been that bad in the last couple of special election cycles, which are notoriously difficult to poll, and the off-year elections in November of 2017. They have been pretty good. Not, stellar, but pretty good. Better than 2016. And 2016 has like a bad misunderstanding of the reputation for how the polls performed. They were reasonably good on the state level, and even on the national level, Hillary Clinton performed within 2 points of where she was supposed to perform in the popular vote. So the notion that the polls were terrible in 2016 isn't really supported. And so far, they're pretty decent. And if you look, the generic ballot is what it is. Generic ballot looks terrible for Republicans, but it doesn't test an actual race. There's no race between a Republican generic candidate and a generic Democratic candidate. It never happens. Once you have a named candidate, things change. And we had a poll this morning, very hopeful poll for Republicans out of, I think it's California's 39th congressional district, where Chairman Ed Royce, Foreign Policy Committee Chairman, I believe, is retiring.
That's Orange County?
Orange County, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is GOP Central.
Right.
And he's retiring, and this is a district that Hillary Clinton won, but that also voted for Mitt Romney, one of 23 similar districts that are key targets for Democrats. And the Republican candidate, who's an Asian American woman, is facing a Democrat who was caught up in a Me Too moment and is a California lottery winner, is kind of a flawed candidate, and she's outperforming him. And she looks like she could hold this seat for Republicans. And that is a race where you would think a generic Democrat would trounce a generic Republican. So once you get a named candidate in there, things do change.
Right.
But there's only so many obstacles you can overcome. The headwinds for Republicans are really sharp. And I expect that the House is lost to them. I'm not sure about the Senate, but I was sure that Republicans were going to keep the Senate 2 weeks ago, and now I'm not so sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of murmurings, but there's still less than just 2 months away here, and we still haven't seen the effect of the FISA release of the documents that are coming out, and that's going to be a slow trickle over the next couple of months. So maybe Trump's got some tricks up his sleeve that we're not aware of right now. Maybe it will impact, I don't know. I want to move to another issue real quickly for you, because this is another important issue that's kind of getting buried in the headlines right now, and this is Iran. You wrote actually a pretty, very highly, I'm going to recommend this to everybody listening to this. Check out Noah's commentary article. John Kerry gives the Iranian theocrats hope. Talk to us a little bit about this. What's going on there?
Yeah, so John Kerry admitted over the course of promoting his memoir to interviewers, very capable interviewers on the right, like Dana Perino over at Fox and Q Hewitt's radio show, that he has had several meetings with his former Iranian counterpart, Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. And the topic of discussion, which was alleged back in May of 2018, and which John Kerry seems to have confirmed without confirming it, essentially just a non-denial, not denial, that he is telling them that the JCPOA, the Iran deal, is alive. You know, it's sort of kicking. And if you hang on, try to wait out the Trump administration, you're going to get a better deal from a Democratic successor. That's not uncommon, but it is dangerous. It's very common, unfortunately, to have past administration members, Democrats, people seeking a high political profile to go out, perform freelance foreign policy, contradict the existing administration in order to get their profile up. You saw it with Jesse Jackson in 1984 visiting the Soviet Union and Cuba, all the way up to 2007 when Nancy Pelosi took a trip to Damascus, where Bashar al-Assad was actively supporting the insurgency that was killing Americans. This sort of despicable behavior, in my view, is very similar to what we're seeing now with John Kerry. John Kerry is essentially telling an Iranian regime which is experiencing enormous pressure from Trump. And this is one of the places where the Donald Trump administration has been a marked improvement on Barack Obama and even George W. Bush to some extent. They are putting so much pressure on the Iranian economy that their citizenry is in arms. They have been in a state of low-level rebellion for nearly a year now. And it is not Iran's nuclear program that threatens us necessarily. It is Iran. It is the state of Iran as the world's chief sponsor of terror. Only something that convinces the Iranian regime to change its character or that dispenses with the Iranian regime altogether from below is going to neutralize that threat. And the Trump administration is making great strides toward achieving that goal. And for John Kerry to arrest that progress, according, by the way, not just to me, but former Democratic Senator Joe Lieberman, this is tantamount to undoing progress that advances American national security. I wouldn't go so far as to call it anything other than that. I'm sure other people who are much more interested in polemics would. I am not. I do think it's irresponsible and dangerous. And I think John Kerry should be called out for it. If he is trying to preserve Barack Obama's legacy at the expense of American national security, that's a very irresponsible thing to do. And I think history will look upon it with disfavor.
And I'm sure it doesn't. There's a lot of people that are scratching their heads wondering, how is this even legal, what he's doing? I know he's acting as a free agent, as you call it. But this is, if he's undermining national security for the United States, and as you said, and I agree with you, I've been watching Iran for decades, the revolution is going to come from the people. Right? And this is what, these sanctions are in effect having on people. They want their genes. They want their movies. Right? But how is not what he is doing treasonous? I mean, people are talking Logan Act here.
Yeah, well, the Logan Act, first of all, has never been enforced. It's a joke of a law that no one ever actually invokes. It's just sort of a rhetorical trick. It should be repealed. Second, treason is a legally defined narrow term that applies only to nation states with which we are currently at war in an active state of war declared by Congress. So even Julius and Ethel Rosenberg weren't charged with treason; they were charged with espionage.
Russian spies.
So you could, you could call it a lot of things, but legally, by definition, you just can't call it treason. And I wouldn't call it the Logan Act because that's just become a joke. So it's not legally. I wouldn't go so far as to say this is legally problematic for John Kerry. I would say that it is untoward and sordid and irresponsible, and he should be called out for it as much as he possibly could be. But I wouldn't go so far as to say the guy could be thrown in the brig for this sort of thing.
Could there be repercussions? I mean, what answers do the Trump administration have on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know what the Trump administration plans to do, and I don't suspect they can do anything. It's so politically fraught. I mean, this guy was a former Democratic presidential nominee, the last Secretary of State. Yeah. You can't lay a hand on him. But they should and are, Secretary Pompeo had made this clear the other day, say that this is virtually unprecedented behavior, that a former Secretary of State is conducting his own foreign policy for a shadow government. That is reckless in the extreme, and it's very unhelpful. And I'd say it's fair for him to say precisely that. I've said that, and I think that more people should be saying it. I don't understand how you can look upon events in Iran over the last year and the pressure that is being exerted on this economy by this administration, and the administration's policy of abrogating the Iran deal with an interest towards neutralizing the threat by virtue of neutralizing this regime, and say that what John Kerry is doing is anything other than counterproductive. He's actively trying to keep the regime in place. You have to call it that. So once you've established that you're working on behalf of the stability of these theocrats, these brutal, vicious mullahs in Tehran, then I don't know what you call it. You definitely could call it rhetorically treasonous. It's certainly not legally treasonous, but it's rhetorically seditious, that's for sure.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Well, got several more questions for you, but I know you're running for time, so would love to have you back on and figure this whole mess out and see maybe where we're at before the election. Noah, where can people find you? Commentary Magazine and like?
Yeah, I write for commentarymagazine.com just about every day, and I tweet at Noah C. Rothman.
Fantastic, Noah. Greatly appreciate you taking the time. Wish you the best. Happy high holidays for you, and we'll see you down the road. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And folks, thanks for following us at whiskeypolitics.net. You can find me and follow me at David Sussman on Twitter, and our podcast series on all of your favorite podcast applications, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and TuneIn Radio. And if you're listening to us on iTunes, please make sure you give us that 5-star rating as it helps others find us. Our video series can be found on YouTube. Please just search Whiskey Politics and you'll find us and subscribe. And if you click the little bell, you'll get notified of upcoming interviews and also America's Voice Network. And of course, our Ricochet Audio Network for our podcasts. Again, very special thanks to Noah Rothman, and we'll be back again very soon. I'm Dave Sussman at Whiskey Politics.